This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. To pre-order Aetherdrift, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Hone. Earlier today, the full card gallery for Aetherdrift dropped, and that means it's time to start my limited set review for the new format. Over the next week or so, I'll be evaluating every single card in the format to get you ready for your pre-release and the release of the set on Magic Arena. We're starting today with the multicolored and colorless cards. Multicolored is always a nice place to start a set review because these cards do a good job of introducing us to the set's archetypes and mechanics, and they also tend to be some of the most powerful cards in a set. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means draft and sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for this video. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about draft and sealed, I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in play boosters. Second, these are of course my evaluations of these cards before it's actually possible to play the format, since the goal here is to have my set review done in time for the pre-release, and that means I'm going to be wrong about some stuff. However, as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have actually turned out. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once a set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the multicolored and colorless cards in Aetherdrift. First up, it's Aetherdrift Emerald Radiant, which for 3 generic, 2 black, and a green is a 3/3 legendary insect druid at rare. When it enters, create a 1/1 green insect creature token for each artifact and or creature card in your graveyard, and whenever another insect you control dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Aetherdrift, and each opponent loses 1 life. So, getting 2 insects out of her enters trigger is going to feel fine, and that seems very doable, and Aetherdrift can definitely make more than that in your typical black-green deck in the format. This color pair is about milling yourself, and by turn 6, you're likely to have some things in your graveyard that will give you insect tokens. To maximize Aetherdrift, you do need to make sure most of the non-lands in your deck are artifacts or creatures, but that's doable enough. Don't forget her ability also works with other insects, and they are around. I do think she's a bomb. I think it'll be pretty easy to get multiple bodies out of her when you cast her. I'm giving her an A-. Next up, it's Apocalypse Runner, which for 2 generic, a red, and a black is a 6/5 vehicle at uncommon. And you can tap it, and target creature you control with power 2 or less gains lifelink until end of turn and can't be blocked this turn, and it has crew 3. So this set has tons and tons of vehicles in it. It does look to me like they set up the format so that it's going to be easier to crew things than it normally would be. For example, there's a lot of 2-mana 3/1s that can crew this thing, and there are lots of payoffs for having vehicles. And I have a feeling that most of the vehicles in this set are going to be at least a little bit better in this set than they would be in a typical one. Anyway, for this particular one, the idea of giving something small lifelink and making it unblockable for a turn is pretty decent. I mean, even if you're just getting in with a 2/2 lifelinker, it can really alter a race. And this also helps you with the speed mechanic, which basically pays you off for doing damage to your opponent each turn. And black-red is the color pair that is the most interested in getting to max speed. Now, it's not the best vehicle in terms of its own stats, but by having an ability that can be relevant on many turns, I think it works out pretty well. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Boom Scholar, which for 1 generic, a red, and a green is a 3/3 Goblin Advisor at uncommon. Exhaust abilities of other permanents you control cost 2 generic less to activate, and it has an exhaust ability, which means you can only use this ability once, and it's 4 generic, a red, and a green, and creatures and vehicles you control gain trample until end of turn, put 2 +1/+1 counters on this creature. So exhaust is the red-green theme, so you can expect to have lots of other permanents have their cost reduced. And this particular exhaust ability does give the Scholar itself trample, and it grows to a 5/5, so even on its own, that's something, and these exhaust abilities can be activated at instant speed, so they do sort of wreak havoc in combat in a big way, the ones that augment creatures. That said, there are a lot of board states where trample to everything is pretty underwhelming. That's an ability that's really only good if you're attacking, obviously enough, and you don't always have big enough creatures for that to make a difference. I think a lot of what makes Boom Scholar good is its ability to decrease the cost of your other exhaust permanents, while also having this exhaust upside on itself. The thing that I think we can compare Exhaust to the most is Disguise and Morph, because those are usually abilities you only get to use once. And in this case, most of the creatures are better than a 3 mana 2/2 or whatever. And so if you think about this ability as just upside on a 3 mana 3/3 that's also making your other Exhaust abilities better, it seems a lot better than it does if you just look at this ability alone. So overall, I think this looks pretty good. It's doing exactly what this deck wants you to do. It's an enabler and a payoff for doing Exhaust stuff as well. I like this card a fair bit. I'm giving it a B-. Doesn't hurt that it's a 3 mana 3/3 either. Next up, it's Boosted Sloop, which for 1 generic, a blue and a red, is a 3/3 artifact vehicle at uncommon. It's got Menace. Whenever you attack, draw a card, then discard a card, and it has Crew 1. So Crew 1, as we've seen in the past, is usually really easy to get going. Almost every single creature and creature token in your deck can crew a Crew 1 vehicle. And this card looks pretty good to me overall. It's basically Smuggler's Copter, but blue-red. I am obviously exaggerating there, but I'm making the comparison for a reason. That card was really, 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 really good. This is probably just pretty good. But there is actually one way it's better than Smuggler's Copter, and that is that it triggers regardless of what you attack with. So the turn you play Boosted Sloop, you can get the first loot trigger by attacking with whatever you already had on the battlefield. And it can let you loot every turn relatively easily. Being a 3 mana 3/3 menace means that it's going to have at least a decent attack a big chunk of the time, which is nice because it means you're going to get to loot. And on top of all of this, the blue-red theme in the format is about discarding cards so you can get extra value out of the Boosted Sloop's ability. And it's just a really good vehicle on rate to begin with, so I like this Signpost uncommon a lot. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we've got Bright Glass Gearhulk, which for 2 green and 2 white is a 4/4 artifact creature construct at Mythic Rare. It has First Strike and Trample, and when this creature enters, you may search your library for up to 2 artifact, creature, and or enchantment cards with mana value 1 or less, reveal them, put them into your hand, and then shuffle. So this cycle of Gearhulks all ask for pretty difficult mana, that is 2 mana of 2 different colors as part of their casting cost. But the good news is all of them are pretty powerful no matter when you play them, so even if you can't play this on 4, you're still going to feel pretty good because a 4 mana 4/4 First Strike Trample body is relevant all game long, and this enters trigger is usually going to be pretty easy to at least get 1 card out of. And if you have Bright Glass Gearhulk in your deck, you should probably lean a little more on 1-drops than you would otherwise so that you can get 2, but you know, there are plenty of good 1-drops in Limited these days, so you don't even have to try that hard to get this going. It is true, the later you cast this, the more likely it is you've drawn all of your 1-drops. So it kind of has diminishing returns as the game goes on, but I still think this is a bomb overall. It has 3-for-1 potential, it's really easy to get a 2-for-1, and the creature it gives you is a very imposing presence, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Broadside Barrage, which costs 1 generic, a blue and a red, for an uncommon instant, and it deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you draw a card and then discard a card. This is a great removal spell. 3 mana for 5 damage means you can do a fair bit of trading up with this, and mixing in a loot is always good, but especially in this format that has plenty of payoffs for discarding cards, especially in this color pair. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Broodheart Engine, which for a black and a green is an uncommon artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, surveil 1, and you can pay 2 generic, a black and a green, and tap it and sacrifice it to return target creature or vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. So I don't love that this doesn't add to the board, but it is going to help enable black-green stuff, which is, you know, a graveyard deck, and it also makes it very possible for you to reanimate something pretty scary on turn 4. There are lots of good cards in this format with cycling that reanimating on turn 4 would feel pretty good. I do think that doesn't add to the battlefield and needs setup downside is a problem, but I don't think you'll be cutting it from your black-green decks either. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Captain Howler, Sea Scourge, which for 2 generic, a blue and a red, is a 5/4 legendary shark pirate at rare. It's got Ward, 2 generic, pay 2 life. And whenever you discard 1 or more cards, target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn for each card discarded this way. Whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player this turn, you draw a card. A 4 mana 5/4 with this Ward is a card you'd already be pretty happy to play since it's got nice stats and it's a real pain for your opponent to kill it. Mix in the fact that this can buff creatures and draw you extra cards on turns when you discard with, you know, something like Boosted Sloop, and we've got something very nice here. Blue-red should have no problem getting him going, and the baseline is already really good, giving him a B+. Next up, it's Caradora, Heart of Alacria, which for 2 generic, a green and a white, is a 4/2 legendary human knight at rare. When it enters, you may search your library for a mount or vehicle card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And if one or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature or vehicle you control, that many +1/+1/+1 counters are put on it instead. So I'm already pretty excited about a 4-mana 4/2 that draws me a mount or vehicle. There are plenty of those in this format. Green-white is more interested in mounts than in vehicles, but you do have access to both. It's not going to be hard to have a target for this like it would be in a typical limited format, because this isn't a typical limited format, at least when it comes to the proportion of mounts and vehicles in it. So that already is a really good card. It's a 2-for-1 with 4 power. It can trade with some significant creatures on the other side. On the flip side, it also dies relatively easy, but because it gives you a card up front, that's not a big deal. And there are several mounts and vehicles in the set that do stuff with counters, and tutoring up one of those is obviously extra good, because then you can also take advantage of Caradora's other ability. It's not a huge theme in green-white in this set. The big theme is, mounts, but it is there, and it's not going to be impossible to take advantage of her ability, because she also tutors up something, right? So overall, I think she just ends up being a bomb. She just gives you so much value for so little mana, giving her an A-. Next up, it's Cloudspire Coordinator, which for a red and a white is a 3/1 human pilot at uncommon. When it enters, you scry 2, and you can tap it and create X 1/1 colorless pilot creature tokens, where X is a number of mounts and or vehicles that enter the battlefield under your control this turn. Those tokens this token saddles mounts and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. So this is really good. I'd already play a 2-mana 3/1 that scries 2 when it enters. I already mentioned that 2-mana 3/1s are better than normal in this set because they can crew everything all the way up to crew 3. And then this has a really strong ability of adding tokens to the board when you play mounts or vehicles, and those tokens can also crew things with up to crew 3. This is going to feel really great to play on turn 2, and it is the kind of card that can really help your opponent run away with the game because they're going to get extra bodies out of it. So you're going to want to kill it when you see it most of the time, but even when you do, your opponent has set up better draws with that scry 2, so you never truly come out like way ahead of Cloudspire Coordinator, and that makes it a really good signpost uncommon, especially in a color pair that is very into vehicles. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Cloudspire Sky Cycle, which for 2 generic, a red and a white, is a 2/3 vehicle at uncommon. It's got flying. When it enters, you distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 other target vehicles and or creatures you control, and it has crew 1. So this is the other Cloudspire Signpost uncommon, and we've seen 4-mana creatures with this enters trigger before, and they always tend to perform pretty well. They come down, add a decent body to the board, while augmenting a couple of other things you've already got around. Not always being a creature is a bit of a bummer, but it can become one relatively easily, and even if it can't, it's usually going to impact the board the turn it comes down. You do need 2 other vehicles and or creatures in play to get both counters, but that's not usually a huge ask in red-white decks. Like, you're going to play something on turn 2 and on turn 3, and then play this on 4, and that's going to be a really strong curve out. This looks like another good signpost uncommon. I'm giving it a B-. Next, it's Coalstoke Gearhulk, which for 1 generic, 2 black, and 2 red is a 5/4 artifact creature construct at Mythic Rare, and when it enters, you put target creature card with mana value 4 or less from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control with a finality counter on it. That creature gains Menace, Death Touch, and Haste. At the beginning of your next end step, exile that creature. Importantly, this can bring a creature back from any graveyard, and it's going to be a great attacker when you get it back, almost no matter what it is, because Menace, Death Touch, and Haste means if your opponent wants to block it, they have to lose 2 cards. So the ideal thing is to get something back that they really don't want to take, which is certainly possible. Obviously, this can help you get to max speed because the thing you get back is very likely to get through. And in this era where we have so many enters and death triggers, it's not out of the question to get a ton of value out of it. I feel like this will deliver 2-for-1 value most of the time. The casting cost is, of course, a little bit difficult, but it's still a really good card. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Debris Beetle, which for 2 generic, a black, and a green is a 6/6 vehicle at rare. It's got trample. When it enters, each opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life, and it has crew 2. This is basically Siege Rhino in vehicle form. Draining 3 life when it enters is a huge deal. So many limited games come down to races, and this alters one in a big way, while also being a reasonable way to help you stabilize if you're behind. It's also a way to potentially get some more speed for your max speed cards that doesn't involve you actually hitting your opponent. And on top of all of that, it's actually a reasonably efficient vehicle that is a very real and relatively easy to crew threat. I mean, after this has come down and done its Drain 3 life thing, you're just going to be crewing it and slamming it into your opponent every turn until they do something about it, and that's just going to win you a lot of games. This delivers a lot of value up front and leaves behind a body that is pretty scary. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Dune Drifter, which for X, a white, and a black is a 3/3 artifact vehicle at uncommon. When it enters, you return target artifact or creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it has crew 2. Getting something back with this will feel pretty good, as it makes it a vehicle that adds to the board up front. And I do like that if you have to, you can run this out on 2. You're not usually going to want to. You're going to want to play this in the later game when it can bring something back, but it is flexible that you can play it on turn 2 if you really need to. All that said, setting up your graveyard isn't going to be automatic. I mean, spending like 6 mana on this to bring back a 4 mana thing in the late game is going to feel pretty solid, but like in the early stages of the game, this card can be a pretty big liability in your hand. I think it's probably a C+. Next up, it's Embalmed Ascendant, which for 1 generic, a white, and a black is a 1/2 zombie at uncommon, and it has Start Your Engines. I've mentioned this mechanic a few times. As it says, if you have no speed, it starts at 1, it increases once on each of your turns when an opponent loses life, max speed is 4. So in other words, you start to track this as soon as you play a card with Start Your Engines, and from then on you track it throughout the rest of the game. It doesn't stay attached only to this Embalmed Ascendant. You end up tracking speed the rest of the game, and you can eventually get to max speed 4, assuming you make your opponent lose life multiple turns. One notable thing about it is I think some people look at this and they think, well, it's going to take 4 turns at a minimum for me to get there, but that's not quite true, because the turn you play it, if it's the first time you've played a Start Your Engines card, you start at 1, and then if you have a good attack and you hit your opponent, you're suddenly at max speed 2. So that can happen the turn you start tracking, because you haven't raised your speed on that particular turn. This is sort of the headliner mechanic in the format. It is difficult to evaluate, I think. I talked about this in a Need to Notes video. It is clear that you're not always going to have max speed, but I think it's doable to get max speed. But when you're evaluating cards that have the max speed effect, like this one does, as we'll see in a moment, you have to take into account how often they won't be fully unlocked. But overall, I do think it's going to end up being a relevant mechanic that actually is active a decent chunk of the time. I can't imagine they would have made it as big of a headliner mechanic as it is if it was like impossible to get going. Anyway, back to Embalmed Ascendant. When it enters, you make a 2/2 black zombie creature token, and it has max speed. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So the baseline here is really good. 3 mana for a 1/2 and a 2/2 is a really good rate. And in a set where black-white has some sacrifice stuff going on, it's sure to be even better. And the max speed trigger here is excellent. It is the kind of thing that's often at its best like later in the game anyway, when you have your opponent at lowish life and you can just like attack with everything and your opponent can't find a way to not die, because if they kill your creatures, they lose life and so on. So this looks like a strong signpost to me. Does exactly what you want your black-white cards to do. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Explosive Getaway, which for 3 generic, a red, and a white is a rare sorcery. Exile up to 1 target artifact or creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Explosive Getaway deals 4 damage to each creature. So the dream here is to exile one of your creatures that would die to this, and then blow up everything else. Then your creature returns unscathed, and maybe you even rebuy an Enters trigger or something. The ceiling here is definitely super high, but there are some problems. Sometimes your opponent will have creatures that are just too big to die to this, and the presence of vehicles in this set also makes all sweepers a little bit worse, especially sorcery speed ones, obviously, because generally they're not going to be crewed during your turn. So even if you manage to like wipe away all of your opponent's creatures and they still have 2 vehicles in play, there's a decent chance they just play another creature or crew one of those vehicles. All of that said, you're still going to come out way ahead most of the time when you cast this, as long as your opponent doesn't both have big creatures and multiple vehicles around. It's going to feel pretty good. I do think that the specifics of this particular limited format keep this from being like a full-on bomb though, but I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Far Fortune End Boss, which for 2 generic, a black, and a red is a 4/5 legendary human mercenary at rare with Start Your Engines. Whenever you attack, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, and it has max speed. If a source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 1 instead. So Far Fortune is a max speed card that really helps you achieve max speed, which is great. The ping effect goes off no matter what you attack with, so this is another card where you can get to speed 2 the turn it comes down pretty often, and the max speed effect is legit, as it effectively boosts all of your creature's power by 1, and turns the ping effect into a shock to your opponent's face. This is quite good. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Fearless Swashbuckler, which for 1 generic, a blue and a red, is a 3/3 fish pirate. At rare, it's got haste. Vehicles you control have haste, and whenever you attack, if a pirate and a vehicle attack this combat, draw 3 cards and discard 2 cards. So even with this being a pirate itself, and this format having lots of vehicles, consistently attacking with both a pirate and a vehicle to get that triggered ability isn't going to be automatic, but it is doable, and the baseline of the card is plenty good, so it isn't like you have to play some woefully inefficient creature to gain access to this effect. Plus, there will be times when you can trigger it the turn it comes down, giving it a B. Next, it's Gastal Thrill Seeker, which for a black and a red is a 2/3 uncommon lizard berserker with Start Your Engines, and when it enters, it deals 1 damage to target opponent and you gain 1 life. It has max speed. This creature has Death Touch and haste. If you hadn't already started your engines, this will get you to speed 2 the turn it drops, and that's pretty great. And it will always raise your speed by 1. The enters trigger is itself already pretty nice to have on a 2-mana 2/3 anyway, and the chances of gaining Death Touch and haste are significant as a result of that same trigger. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Guidelight Pathmaker, which for 4 generic, a white and a blue, is a 6/5 vehicle at uncommon. It has vigilance, and when it enters, you may search your library for an artifact card and reveal it. Put it onto the battlefield if its mana value is 2 or less. Otherwise, put it into your hand, then shuffle, crew 2. So without the enters trigger, this would be pretty mediocre. Its stats aren't great for an expensive vehicle, although crew 2 isn't too bad. You generally expect vehicles to be like above rate because they are conditional creatures after all. However, being able to tutor up any artifact is good, and you can even choose to grab one that will immediately add to the board if that's what you have to do. This is a very strong 2-for-1, and it goes great in this color pair, which is about artifacts more broadly and not just vehicles. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Haunt the Network, which for 3 generic, a blue and a black, is an uncommon sorcery. Choose target opponent, create 2 1/1 colorless stop your artifact creature tokens with flying, then the chosen player loses X life and you gain X life for X is the number of artifacts you control. So the baseline here is that you pay 5 mana for 2 1/1 Thopters and you drain your opponent 2 life. That's not good, but that is the absolute floor on this card. And this will often drain far more life while adding bodies to the board. Even draining like 4 or 5 with this is a big upgrade, and obviously the ceiling is even higher than that. Blue-black is also into artifacts, but it likes having them in the graveyard, and it's more of a control deck. And this card fits perfectly there. Like, this is the kind of card that this deck will cast against more aggressive opponents, and it will allow them to stabilize by giving them a couple of bodies and gaining them some life, buying them the time they need to win the game. And overall, this just looks really good to me. It's going to close out some games. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Haunted Hellride, which for 1 generic, a blue and a black, is a 3/3 vehicle at uncommon. Whenever you attack, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains Death Touch until end of turn. Untap it, and it has crew 1. So this is a nice attack trigger, and it's another one that triggers whenever you attack at all. Haunted Hellride doesn't have to be doing the rumbling, so that means the turn it comes down, you can give something +1/+0 and Death Touch and Pseudo Vigilance just right away. And that's obviously going to give you a much better attack than you had before, and it's the kind of trigger that lets just about anything attack on almost any type of board. In the meantime, the fact it's a crew 1 vehicle means that it's pretty easy to send it in when you need to, and obviously it has important artifact and vehicle typing. Overall, this looks like another good signpost uncommon. I'm giving this one a B-. Next up, it's Ketramos, the New Dawn, which for 1 generic, a white and a black, is a 4/4 legendary god at Mythic Rare. It's got Menace, Lifelink, and Indestructible, but it can't attack or block unless there are 7 or more cards in exile. Whenever 1 or more cards are put into exile from graveyards and or the battlefield during your turn, you draw a card and lose 1 life. This card is super cool and super powerful, and the art's great, but it wasn't designed for limited. If we had an exile mechanic of some sort in this set, that would be one thing, but we don't. There's no mechanic really built around exiling. Getting to 7 exiled cards is going to be near impossible, and you're not going to trigger it often enough for it to make up for that with its ability. So mostly it's a 3 mana 4/4 with all these cool keywords that doesn't actually matter or meaningfully add to the board in any way. It's just an F in limited. Next up, it's Colorless, Triumph Caster, which for a red and a white is a 2/3 legendary human pilot at rare. Mounts and vehicles you control have haste. Whenever a mount you control enters, it becomes saddled until end of turn. Whenever a vehicle you control enters, it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. Obviously, this is really well positioned in this set. You know, this would be kind of a funny throwaway card in your typical limited format where you're like, well, you're never actually going to trigger any of this. But in this format, you will. As you've already seen in this video, there are vehicles everywhere and mounts. And this makes it so they'll be at their best the turn they come down, which matters because they'll also be able to attack right away. This is going to result in some pretty insane curves sometimes where you can just smash in with huge vehicles and fully saddled mounts that give you all sorts of bonus effects. And on top of all of that, he's got a pretty good stat line, so he looks quite good. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Lagarin, Soul of Alakria, which for a green and a white is a 1/3 legendary beast mounted uncommon. It's got flying, and when it attacks while saddled, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target mounts and or vehicles, and it has saddle 1. So keep in mind, this can put one of those counters on itself, and obviously if you saddled it, you have one other creature, so you'll be getting 2 counters virtually any time you do saddle Lagarin. And that is an effect that can quickly snowball, especially because Lagarin itself will grow. The one thing I don't love here is just that being a 2 mana 1/1 does make it super vulnerable for a turn. It also means when you draw it later in the game and don't play it as a 2-drop, it's not going to be nearly as imposing. Being able to actually take advantage of those counters isn't always going to be easy when it's like turn 7 and this is what you draw off the top of your library. But it's still really good, and it's going to be really scary, like must-kill threat on turn 2. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Loot the Pathfinder, who for 2 generic, a green, a blue, and a red is a 2/4 legendary beast noble at mythic rare, comes with double strike, vigilance, and haste, and it comes with 3 exhaust abilities. You can pay 1 green and tap it to add 3 mana of any one color, you can pay blue and tap it to draw 3 cards, and you can pay red and tap it to do 3 damage to any target. So he's a little hard to cast, though this format does have pretty good mana overall. There is a cycle of dual lands at common, as well as the usual like land enters tapped, name a color, common, you know, that will fix your mana. And green always has access to a bit of fixing anyway, so he's definitely castable. And a 2/4 double striker is not something your opponent can ignore, and this comes with 3 great abilities. Basically, it can Lightning Bolt, Ancestral Recall, or Sword of Dark Ritual. It's kind of weird that 2 of the effects are cards from Alpha that are part of a cycle, but I guess they decided they didn't want the last ability to be Giant Growth, since that would be kind of insane. But anyway, the point is, Loot is a threatening body, one that can generate a 5-for-1 if given the time, and ideally, you want to wait until you can play the Bolt or Recall ability when he comes down, effectively making it cost 6, but it's still going to be well worth it. And it makes sure you get value out of Loot right away. Even if your opponent kills it, they're going to come out way behind. And mana is good enough in this format that I don't think this needs like a build around grade or anything like that. I think you're going to find a way to play this in most of your decks that are green-red or blue-red because the mana will allow you to do it. Overall, I think Loot is a bomb. The mana thing holds it back some. Like, if this were easy to cast, it would probably just be an A+. But I think the mana situation probably holds it to an A-. Next up, it's Mendicant Core, Guidelight, which for a blue and a white is a star 3 legendary artifact creature robot at rare. Its power is equal to the number of artifacts you control. It has start your engines, and it has max speed. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, you can pay 1 generic. If you do, copy it. So this is a 1/3 on its own, and it will frequently have more power than that, but the real value here can come from the max speed effect, as doubling artifacts for only 1 generic is a pretty big deal, and not just because it raises his power even more. Problem is, max speed is already kind of situational. Like, you really need to have the game go in the right direction for you to achieve max speed, and asking you after that to also have cards with the right type, even in a color pair that cares about that type, worries me a little bit. Like, the cards that have max speed effects that just are inherent to the card, that do something to the board or make things different in the game already, are a lot better overall in Limited than a card that needs you to do something else before you have access to this effect. So, you know, Mendicant Core is good, but I think it's probably just a B-. Next up, it's Mimeoplasm, Revered One, which for X, black, green, and blue is a 0/0 legendary ooze at Mythic Rare. As it enters, you exile up to X creature cards from your graveyard. It enters with 3 +1/+1 counters on it for each creature card exiled this way, and you can pay 2 generic to have it become a copy of target creature card exiled with it, except it's a 0/0 and it has this ability. So casting this at 4, probably not something you want to do. It gives you a hill giant with only a tiny bit of upside, especially because it requires so much setup to actually even do that. But once you spend 2 on X, we're talking about a 5 mana 6/6. If you spend 3 or 6 total mana, you're talking about a 6 mana 9/9. So things certainly scale, though you do need to keep in mind you want to always have stuff to exile that makes a big difference, especially because Mimeoplasm shrinks itself to a 0/0 when it copies the thing. So it's not like it'll have all these counters on top of the stat lines of the creatures it's copying. It'll just have those abilities. But, you know, a 9/9 with any abilities at all is going to be pretty good, for example. It does take some significant setup, but it just ends up being so efficient at higher points on the curve that it's hard for me to imagine this isn't pretty good. And there are going to be times where it's nuts, you know, where you can give it flying and vigilance or whatever because of the stuff that it can copy. So I think it's a B. Next up, it's Oil Deep Gearhulk, which for 2 blue and 2 black is a 4/4 artifact creature construct at Mythic Rare with lifelink and Ward 1. And when it enters, you look at target player's hand. You may choose a card from it. If you do, that player discards that card, then draws a card. So it's kind of cool that you can use this to disrupt your opponent, or you can use it to let you rummage. I mean, most of the time you're going to want to do the first thing, especially if your opponent has lots of cards, because chances are very good that whatever random card they draw is going to be worse than the best card in their hand. Notably, this can even hit lands, unlike most versions of this effect. Probably doesn't come up a ton in Limited, but that is a little unusual. And it also makes the rummage option more appealing, so you can target yourself, discard a land, and then draw something better. Either way, it's a pretty good effect, and the creature you get is reasonably imposing, but it's not anything insane, especially because casting this on actual 4 isn't going to happen all that often. So a 4 mana, 4/4 lifelink and Ward 1, like on turn 6, isn't going to be anything insane. It also doesn't generate a full card of value no matter which way you go with the ability, so it doesn't have the 2-for-1 potential some of the other Gearhulks do. I think this one's just a B. Next up, it's Pyrewood Gearhulk, which for 2 generic, 2 red, and 2 green is a 7/7 artifact creature construct at Mythic Rare. It's got Vigilance and Menace, and when it enters, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Menace until end of turn. Damage can't be prevented this turn. So the buff of Vigilance plus Menace lets you get in a big attack on your opponent, and it's not a big attack that puts you in that much risk since your attackers don't have to tap. Anytime we have mass pump effects that give Vigilance, just makes them way more flexible, because when they don't give Vigilance, oftentimes you need to be able to create lethal damage the turn you have that buff come down, because all your creatures are tapped now. But you don't have to do that when you get Vigilance, and Menace means those creatures will be harder to block, and +2/+2 means that almost any creature will be a legit threat, especially once it has Menace. So this effect is going to end a lot of games. Now, are there going to be times where you have like 2 creatures in play and this doesn't exactly do what you need it to? Sure. But even then, you probably have 2 pretty good attacks and a 7/7 with Vigilance and Menace on the board. So the potential here is really, really high, and the floor is fairly high too. I mean, you know, you're rarely going to have absolutely nothing on the battlefield by the time you cast the Gearhulk. And for only 6 mana, this is a pretty big effect too. Even if, like all the Gearhulks, it's a little tricky to cast, you are more likely to have double red, double green by turn 6 than you are like on turn 4, like some of the others. I think this one's a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Ranger's Ether Hive, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue, is a 3/5 vehicle at uncommon. It's got Vigilance, and whenever you activate an Exhaust ability, you create a 1/1 colorless Stopter artifact creature token with flying, and it's got Crew 1. I already kind of don't hate a 3 mana, 3/5 Vigilance vehicle with Crew 1. And if you even get 1 Thopter out of this, you're going to feel pretty good. And blue-green is one of the color pairs that's into Exhaust, so it's not going to be hard to do that. I really like that the baseline here is so reasonable and the upside is so high. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Redshift Rocketeer Chief, which for a red and a green is a 2/3 legendary goblin pilot at rare. It's got vigilance. You can tap it and add X mana of any one color where X is Redshift's power. Spend this mana only to activate abilities, and it has exhaust, 10 generic, a red and a green. Put any number of permanent cards from your hand onto the battlefield. I hate to crush everyone's dreams, but you're almost never going to do something meaningful with that awesome exhaust ability. Even if Redshift does help you pay for it, which he does. This is because in Limited, you don't often have a bunch of permanents sitting around in your hand by the time this ability truly comes online. However, Redshift has nice stats and can use his mana to pay for other abilities that are likely to be more meaningful. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Riptide Gearhulk, which for 1 generic, 2 white, and 2 blue is a 2/5 artifact creature construct at Mythic Rare, has double strike and prowess, and when it enters for each opponent, put up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls into its owner's library, third from the top. So, double strike and prowess are a nasty combination that makes it a real headache to ever block or attack into this thing, and the enters trigger is really strong. It's essentially a removal spell. Like all of the Gearhulks, you do have to dock this a little bit for the fact that it's going to be hard to actually cast this on 5, which is when it would be the most insane. But it's always going to feel really good to cast this thing between adding a real body to the board and removing your opponent's best non-land permanent. You know, if it was easy to cast, this is another one that'd probably be like an A+, but I do think the mana holds it to an A-. Next up, it's Rocketeer Boost Buggy, which for a red and a green is a 3/2 artifact vehicle at uncommon. When it attacks, you create a treasure token, and it has exhaust for 3 generic. This vehicle becomes an artifact creature, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it has crew 1. I'm already pretty happy for a 2 mana 3/2 vehicle with crew 1 that makes a treasure when it attacks. It's not a game-changing vehicle, but it's a lot for your mana investment since it even gives you 1 mana back. And I love that when you have the mana to spare, you can just turn it into a 4/3 and never worry about crewing it again. And you can even just do it on the next turn, which is sometimes going to be the correct play. This is a good signpost uncommon. You know, it gives you treasure to help you pay for exhaust. It has an exhaust ability itself, giving it a B. Next up, it's Sabsunin Luxa Embodied, which for 3 generic, a green and a blue, is a 6/6 legendary god at Mythic Rare. It's got reach, trample, and indestructible. It can attack or block unless it has an even number of counters on it. And at the beginning of your first main phase, you put a +1/+1 counter on Sabsunin. Then, if it has an odd number of counters on it, you draw 2 cards. So, this is nuts. It's a super scary creature half the time, and a card that draws you 2 cards during your upkeep the other half of the time. The great thing is that the extra cards she draws you when she's not really a creature, I mean, she is a creature, but she can't attack or block, helps make up for the fact that you suddenly have a god that isn't impacting the board. Because you're likely to draw at least 1 card that lets you impact the board, and then on other turns she'll just be smashing in for a bunch of damage. She can also crew vehicles and stuff even when she can't attack or block, and obviously that matters in this format. I think she might be the biggest bomb in the format. She's certainly on the short list for me. You're going to be ecstatic regardless of which of these effects you get, whether you have her as a huge creature or you're drawing 2 cards, and alternating between those 2 things is really strong. I'm giving her an A+. Next up, it's Samut the Driving Force, which for 3 generic, a red, a green, and a white is a 4/5 legendary human warrior cleric at rare. It's got first strike, vigilance, and haste, and start your engines. Other creatures you control get +X/+0, where X is your speed, and non-creature spells you cast cost X less to cast, where X is your speed. So unlike most speed cards, this one does something even when you're not at max speed, and all on her own, Samut will give your other creatures +1/+0, while giving you a pretty aggressive body that's pretty difficult to block or attack through all game long. Decreasing the cost of your spells matters, but not nearly as much as an effect that actually augments your board immediately. If you have more than 1 speed when you play her, she's already going to feel pretty ridiculous, and sometimes, obviously, she'll be giving +4/+0 to everything. So she has a really big impact on the board between her own ability to attack right away and her ability to augment your creatures no matter what. I think she's a bomb. I'm giving her an A-. Next up, it's Sita Varma, Masked Racer, which for a green and a blue is a 2/3 legendary human rogue at rare. She has exhaust for X, 2 green, and a blue, and you put X +1/+1 counters on her. Then you may have the base power and toughness of each other creature you control become equal to Sita Varma's power. until end of turn. She starts out with decent enough stats for a 2-colored card, and her exhaust ability can be pretty nasty, especially because she doesn't tap, and you can do it at instant speed. So if you have a bunch of mana up and Seat of Arma in play, the situation is an absolute nightmare for your opponent, and that nightmare will often kill them. It doesn't even have to be that late in the game for her to be crazy, as if you grow Seat of Arma to a 4/5, the bump to base power 4 for all of your creatures is likely to be pretty legit. That said, it is mana intensive and you need a decent board state for her to really go off. I'm giving her a B. Next up, it's Sky Serpent Seeker, which for a green and a blue is a 1/1 snake at uncommon. It's got flying and death touch and exhaust for 4 generic. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal 2 land cards. Put those land cards onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So the fail case here is that you get a creature who can trade for anything at a reasonable price, and if you get too exhausted, it'll become a more relevant creature while also ramping your mana. It is technically like a 3-for-1 when you hit 2 lands with it, which is pretty insane. Obviously, it can allow you to pay for your other exhaust abilities and stuff like that. So this just offers a lot of value while having a very reasonable baseline. There will be times where it dies to like an incidental ping effect that won't feel great, but it's still a pretty good card overall, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Thundering Broodwagon, which for 2 generic, 2 black, and 2 green is a 6/5 vehicle at uncommon. It has menace and reach, and when it enters, you destroy target non-land permanent opponent controls with mana value 4 or less. It has crew 3 and cycling for 2 generic. So take away everything but what this is as a vehicle, like its stats and its keywords, and it's not very impressive. Like, you want more than that for 6 mana. But man, this interest trigger is legit. You'll destroy something super relevant while adding this to the board, and it's great that if you draw this early and you don't really want your hard-to-cast 6-drop in your hand, you can throw it away for a new card, and because you're in black-green, you can potentially reanimate it or get it back in your hand later when you can cast this, and it has a huge impact on the game. The fact that it has Menace combines nicely with the interest trigger to an extent too, as killing a creature with it makes it less likely that your opponent can block your 6/5. This looks really good to me overall since it impacts the board and cycling makes it so flexible, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Veteran Beast Rider, which for 1 generic, a green, and a white is a 3/4 human knight at uncommon. At the beginning of your end step, untap each creature you control, and you can pay 2 generic, a green, and a white, and creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This has nice stats, and at a minimum, comes with pseudo vigilance. Obviously, the idea here is that untapping your creatures makes it easier for you to crew and saddle things. Meanwhile, its activated ability is pretty legit and makes it a real threat in the later stages of the game, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Voyage Home, which for 5 generic, a white and a blue is an uncommon sorcery with affinity for artifacts, which means it costs 1 generic less to cast for each artifact you control, and you can draw 3 cards and gain 3 life. So I always like cards that draw and gain life at the same time. While not adding anything to the board is always a problem, the life gain does soften the blow. If you can pay 5 for this, you'll feel kind of alright about it, but you probably need to be able to consistently get it to 4 or less. One cool thing is that in the late game, there's a reasonable chance you can cast this and play some of the stuff you draw too. All that said, this is super clunky, and if you can't get affinity set up in a significant way, it's kind of going to be a liability. I think that holds it to a C, even in an artifact set. Next up, it's Winter Cursed Rider, who for a blue and a black is a 3/2 human warlock at rare. He's got ward, pay 2 life, and artifacts you control have ward, pay 2 life, and he has exhaust, 2 generic, a blue and a black, and tap him. Exile X artifact cards from your graveyard. Each other non-artifact creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. A 2-mana 3/2 with ward, pay 2 life is a solid card. Feels pretty good on 2 and will affect the opponent's life total no matter what. And there are enough artifacts in the format for it to matter that they also get ward. Winter's strongest effect is, of course, his exhaust ability. It takes some setup, but blue-black is going to be fairly good at getting artifacts in the graveyard, so there are going to be times where he can wipe much of the board while keeping himself and your artifacts alive. Bad news is your opponent is reasonably likely to have artifact creatures themselves, so it's not like it will always be this one-sided board wipe, but it's still a really powerful effect, and you've got a good baseline, giving him a B+. Our last multicolored card is Zahur, Glory's Past, who for a white and a black is a 3/2 legendary zombie count warrior at rare with Start Your Engines. Sacrifice another creature, surveil 1, activate only once each turn, and his max speed ability says whenever a non-token creature you control dies, create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token. So even without max speed, this is pretty nice. You don't always want to give up a creature for Surveil, but it can definitely help you quickly load the graveyard, and if you sacrifice something expendable or have a payoff for sacrificing things, which are around, it gets even better. And the max speed ability here is, of course, one such ability. And once that's online, Zahur will be truly insane, but like I've been saying, don't expect that to be unlocked all the time. I'm giving this a B. Now let's take a look at the colorless artifacts, starting with Ether Jacket, which is 3 generic for a 2/1 artifact creature Thopter at common. It's got flying and vigilance. You can pay 2 and tap it and sacrifice it to destroy another target artifact. Activate only as a sorcery. Only having 1 toughness on a 3-drop is pretty brutal, but it can attack okay in the air, and the utility this offers is legit in this artifact heavy set. It is a bit of a problem that it's a tap ability, so you have to have it stick around a full turn to destroy an artifact. Also being sorcery speed is certainly a downgrade. I think this will make the cut sometimes, but it's not amazing or anything. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's the Aether Spark, which for 4 generic is a legendary artifact planeswalker equipment at Mythic Rare, starts with 4 loyalty. As long as it's attached to a creature, it can't be attacked, and has whenever equipped creature deals combat damage during your turn, put that many loyalty counters on the Aether Spark. It's got a +1 that says attach the Aether Spark up to 1 target creature you control, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. It's got a -5 that says draw 2 cards, and a -10 that says add 10 mana of any one color. This is pretty strong. It can protect itself while buffing creatures and can rapidly gain loyalty once it's attached. I mean, there are going to be times where you stick this on something and you attack with that thing with the intention for it to die because you can get so much loyalty that you can draw more cards. The mana ability is far less exciting and limited because you rarely have things to spend that much mana on, even in a format with Exhaust. But everything this does is really strong. The biggest thing is that it protects itself when it's attached to things, at least from creatures being able to attack it. One of the big downsides is that you really need a creature to get this going, and another one is that artifact removal, like the Aether Jacket that we just saw, can just destroy this. You know, there are downsides to having that artifact typing, and that's a pretty big one. Still, it's going to be pretty easy to attach this to things, buff your creatures, and get lots of loyalty, like way more loyalty than you'd normally be able to with a Planeswalker. And the fact it stays safe from attacks, at least, when it's attached to things is a big deal. I think it's a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Camera Launcher, which for 3 generic is a 2/2 artifact creature construct at common, and it has Exhaust, 3 generic, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. It's pretty tough to play a Grey Ogre in today's Magic the Gathering. There are a couple of 1-mana removal spells at lower rarities that can easily kill this, and that is absolutely backbreaking. But this Exhaust ability is pretty legit. Sure, spending 6 total mana for a 3/3 and a 1/1 flyer isn't something you would normally sign up for, but when you can do it in installments and do the second half at instant speed, it certainly gets better. Still, the starting stat line and the lack of efficiency overall holds this back significantly, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Guidelight Matrix, which for 2 generic is a common artifact. When it enters, you draw a card. You can pay 2 generic and tap it, and target mount you control becomes saddled until end of turn, activate only as a sorcery, and you can pay 2 generic and tap it, and target vehicle you control becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. It's nice as replaces itself up front, and those 2 activated abilities are certainly going to be better in this set than in most, but most of the time you'd much rather crew or saddle things instead of spending mana on them. Although this does get interesting when you have more really high crew and saddle costs in your deck, but the format is set up well enough for those things that this still just feels really clunky. If it didn't replace itself, I'd probably give it an F, but because it draws you a card and it's an artifact in a format where that matters, I'm giving it a D. Next, it's Lifecraft Engine, which for 3 generic is a 4/4 artifact vehicle at rare. When it enters, you choose a creature type. Vehicle creatures you control are the chosen type in addition to their other types. Each creature you control of the chosen type other than this vehicle gets +1/+1, and it has crew 3. This set doesn't have a massive creature type theme, but it is somewhat present. You know, there are a lot of insects in black-green. There are a lot of pirates in blue-red. There's a decent number of pilots all across the colors. So there are creature types that show up on more than one card. and typically this will be a vehicle that can at least buff a few creatures in your deck while also buffing all of your vehicles because they gain whatever type you choose. Crew 3 is a lot, but I do think this provides value right when it comes down because you can always choose a creature type that you have already in play too. So this looks pretty good to me. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Market Back Walker, which for X is a 0/0 artifact creature construct at rare. It enters with X +1/+1 counters on it. You can pay 4 generic to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and when it dies, you draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on it. This is a fun callback to Hangerback Walker, and while it's not quite as good as that absolutely bonkers card, it's still really good. Even if you just play this as a 2-mana 1/1 that draws you a card when it dies, you're not going to feel terrible about it, especially because later in the game you can pump mana into it to make it bigger. Obviously, it really shines when you can make it like a 3/3, but everywhere you can cast it on the curve is going to feel pretty good, and it's going to generate significant value. There are other ways to put counters on it too, which make it even better. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Marshall's Path Cruiser, which for 3 generic is a 6/5 artifact vehicle at uncommon. When it enters, you search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And it has an exhaust ability that costs 1 mana of each color, and it becomes an artifact creature, and you put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and it's got Crew 5. I really hope this card is good and limited, because this is what I like to do. Search up lands and multicolor nonsense decks, and eventually have the card that searched me up a land turn into an actual win condition. The bad news is this format looks fast enough that this isn't going to be amazing. I mean, it's a vehicle that is very hard to actually add to the board with thanks to Crew 5, and that seems like a liability when your opponents are getting to max speed and you can't do anything about it. I don't think it's terrible since it gives you something in addition to a land, and fixing is always valuable, but I'm starting this at a C and hoping that I'm wrong. Next up, it's Monument to Endurance, which for 3 generic is a rare artifact. Whenever you discard a card, choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn, draw a card, create a treasure token, each opponent loses 3 life. This is a very powerful discard build-around, and Blue-Red is especially loaded up with lots of nice ways to discard cards, including cycling, which can be found throughout the set, and is a really sweet way to trigger this because you're already drawing a card when you cycle something, and then you're getting this additional value. This, of course, doesn't add to the board on its own, but it's cheap enough and pays you back in a big way that it seems like a legit build-around to me. I mean, it's probably an F in most decks in the format where you have like 1 or 2 cards that can trigger it. But if you're in blue-red or happen to have a lot of ways to discard cards in other color pairs, this is going to be a really strong win condition. I'm giving it an A- in that style of deck. Next up, it's Pit Automaton, which for 2 generic is a 0/4 artifact creature constructed uncommon. It's got Defender. You can tap it for 2 colorless and spend that mana only to activate abilities. You can pay 2 generic and tap it, and when you next activate an exhaust ability this turn, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. So this is really all in on exhaust, although it's nice its mana ability also works on other abilities. It reminds me a little bit of Omen Hawker, a card that worked really nicely in March of the Machine because abilities were everywhere, and I think this is kind of similar. Most decks will have exhaust abilities that this can be used on, and doubling exhaust abilities can potentially be pretty strong. I don't think it needs a build-around grade because exhaust is plentiful enough, although obviously it gets worse the less exhaust you have, because if it's just turning into a 2-mana 0/4 and not much else, it's probably not a card you're running. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Racer's Scoreboard, which for 4 generic is an uncommon artifact with Start Your Engines. When it enters, you draw 2 cards and discard a card, and at max speed, spells you cast cost 1 generic less to cast. This is a bad card. 4 mana to draw 2 and discard 1 isn't where you want to be, even if you do have discard payoffs, especially when you're not adding to the board. And even once you get to max speed, the ability just isn't that exciting and limited. A discount by that point will usually be meaningless or close to it. And yeah, not adding to the board at 4 mana is brutal. This is an F. Next up, it's Radiant Lotus, which for 6 generic is a mythic rare artifact. You can tap it and choose 1 or more artifacts and choose a color. Target player adds 3 mana of the chosen color for each artifact sacrificed this way. Cool design that lets you turn any artifact into Black Lotus, more or less, but it's not here for limited. Once you've got 6 mana, you're not exactly going to be desperate to give up a bunch of artifacts for more mana. Even in a format with exhaust, it's an F. Next up, it's Rover Blades, which for 3 generic is a 2/2 artifact equipment vehicle at uncommon. It has double strike, the equipped creature has double strike, it equips for 4 generic, and it has crew 2. So if this were an equipment 100% of the time, it would be bad. It's just too expensive to play and equip, and even if the creature it gets put on will probably become a threat, the amount of time and mana it takes means that isn't that big of a deal. However, also being a vehicle means that this is effectively modal, and it can actually be relevant on the board before it ever equips to anything. Of course, it does need to be crewed, which itself is a problem, but its crew cost isn't crazy or anything. I mean, a 3 mana 2/2 with double strike that doesn't need to be crewed or anything else is a solid card. This has a little bit of upside beyond that, but has more downside than upside overall, I'd say, so I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Scrap Compactor, which for 1 generic is a common artifact. You can pay 3 generic and tap it to sacrifice it and deal 3 damage to target creature, or you can pay 6 generic and tap it and sacrifice it to destroy a creature or vehicle. We see this style of card a lot, and it's just always a D, even in an artifact set. It can remove stuff, but it does so inefficiently that it amounts to just being the kind of removal you play when you're truly desperate. You're usually going to end up spending more mana on this to kill your opponent's thing than whatever they spent on the thing you're killing, and that's just not really where you want to be when you're casting removal and using removal in limited, so yeah, it's a D. Next up, it's Skybox Fairy, which for 5 generic is a 4/4 artifact vehicle at common. It's got flying and crew 2, and you can cycle it for 2 generic. So these days, a 5 mana 4/4 with flying, if that's what this always was, is pretty medium. Sure, the body is imposing, but not delivering any real value apart from adding a body to the board is kind of a liability these days. And then, this is a conditional 5 mana 4/4 with flying, and I don't love that. It does cycle, which matters. Getting artifacts in your graveyard and vehicles in your graveyard is relevant, and obviously just cycling in general is because of the blue-red deck, but this is just sort of like a mediocre payoff or enabler for a bunch of different decks in the format, but it's never going to feel very good in any of them, giving it a D+. Next up, it's Starting Column, which for 3 generic is a common artifact with Start Your Engines. You can tap it and add 1 mana of any color, and if you have max speed, you can tap it and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards and then discard a card. 3 mana rocks that can tap for mana of any color need to do something pretty significant extra and limited to be worth it, and this can, since in theory, by the later stages of the game, you can cash it in for some cards, but it's still a card that doesn't add to the board, and it's very tough to get around something like that when it has such a small impact. I think it's a D. Next up, it's Ticket Tortoise, which for 2 generic is a 3/1 artifact creature turtle at common. It's got Defender, and when it enters, if an opponent controls more lands than you create a treasure token. This actually seems pretty solid. Sure, it can't attack, but it has a useful type, can crew things pretty well, and gives you 2 artifacts a decent chunk of the time in a format where getting 2 artifacts out of 1 card definitely matters. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Walking Sarcophagus, which for 2 generic is a 2/1 artifact creature zombie cat at common with Start Your Engines, and it has max speed. It gets +1/+2. This is underwhelming. The starting stat line is bad, and while artifact typing is useful, the rest of what this has going on doesn't really do it for me. Sure, you can start tracking speed on turn 2, but there are many cards in the set that can do that are better than this, which to me means that this is going to be a 2-drop you play only when you didn't get the much better ways to start tracking your speed in the early game, giving it a D+. And our last colorless artifact is Wreck Remover, which for 4 generic is a 3/4 artifact creature construct at common. When it enters or attacks, you exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard and you gain 1 life, and it has cycling for 2 generic. This is a reasonable way to hate on the graveyard, and there are certainly decks in the format that care about that. 1 life is a nice little bonus, and the fact you can cycle this when it's not worth using is important too. It's one way to get an artifact into your graveyard for all those various synergies. Still, it's pretty mediocre overall. I think it does just enough to make the cut a significant amount of the time, but it's certainly not a card you always play either. I'm giving it a C-. Alright, we're moving to lands now, starting with Amonkhet Raceway. It's an uncommon land with Start Your Engines. You can tap it for colorless, and if you have max speed, you can tap it and target creature gains haste until end of turn. If this could always give something haste, it would be solid, but actually not completely insane, mostly because it can be super awkward to have a land that grants haste, since haste only matters for a turn, and you tend to tap your lands to cast your creatures, so you need to have this sitting around and ready to go at the right time for haste to matter, and haste also just isn't a keyword that is relevant all the time. Throw in the fact that this is bad for your mana, and it doesn't even always give you haste, And I think we're looking at a pretty mediocre land. The big question about all of these Start Your Engines lands that we're about to see is how valuable is it having a land that can start your engines for no mana at all? And like, I think that is worth something, but I think it's probably just going to be better to play Start Your Engine cards that do something meaningful other than being bad at producing mana. Like putting this in your deck in a limited format, and in limited formats you virtually always have bad mana. Like, it is a significant cost and a significant drag on your deck, and I think that makes it a D+. Next up, it's Avishkar Raceway, which is a common land with Start Your Engines, taps for colorless, it has max speed, 3 generic, tap, discard a card, draw a card. So a land that always had this activated ability wouldn't be that great. The hit to your mana base isn't worth an overcosted rummage. I mean, the effect is nice when you have nothing else to do or you have some discard payoffs, but again, this has the same sorts of problems where it really hurts your mana base, and I don't think the upside is really worth it, giving it a D. We've also got a cycle of gain lands in this set, which we've seen many times. They are all common lands that enter tapped. When they enter, you gain 1 life, and they can tap for mana of 2 different colors. This is always a nice cycle to have. It makes mana much more consistent in 2-color decks and makes it easier to splash. It's not a super exciting cycle, but the life gain does make up a little bit for the fact that they enter tapped. These are always right around a C+. You'll take them to shore up your mana or splash something when they're around. Next, there's Muruganda Raceway, which is a rare land with Start Your Engines. It can tap for colorless, and it has max speed, at which point it can tap for 2 colorless. So, like I've said already, a land that taps for 1 colorless is actively bad and limited. It hurts your mana base, and there's no reason to run it in almost any format. But this does have the potential of giving you 2 mana. Problem is, most of the time, but you have max speed, this mana boost is a lot less relevant. Again, I'm interested to see whether these Start Your Engines lands are all better than I expect just because of Start Your Engines, but for now I'm pretty skeptical. I think this one's a D. Next up, it's Night Market, which is a common land. It enters tapped. As it enters, you choose a color, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of the chosen color, and it has cycling for 3 generic. We see this kind of land in limited in most sets these days, and this one adds cycling, which is pretty nice. Cycling for 3 is super expensive, but generally when you want to cycle away your land is in the late game when you're flooding out and you just want to throw this away. So you'll probably have the mana and be okay. And earlier in the game, it's just really good for your mana. I think it's a C+. We've also got the remaining 5 cards in the Verge cycle. All of them are rare lands. They can tap for 1 color of mana naturally, and they can tap for a 2nd color of mana, but only if you control a land with the basic land type of one of this land's 2 colors. These are really good dual lands that are going to enter untapped and usually be able to produce 2 colors in most of your decks. So these are like significantly better, I think, than the gain lands. I'm giving them a B- collectively. There's also a cycle of roads. All of these are uncommon, non-basic lands that enter tapped unless you control a mount or vehicle. They can tap for 1 color, and you can pay 1 generic and a mana of the color it can tap for, tap it, and sacrifice the land to create a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token with. This token saddles, mounts, and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater, activate only as a sorcery. It's kind of unexciting that all 5 of these lands are like completely identical. I mean, I get it, they're going for the race theme and all the colors are interested in racing. But even though the design is kind of uninspired for a cycle of lands, these are pretty good. They're going to enter untapped a decent chunk of the time, and playing a land that enters tapped is well worth the upside of later in the game being able to create a very relevant creature token. I mean, getting a 1/1 at all is pretty nice, but having a creature token that is really good at crewing and saddling is certainly relevant in this format. So I like this cycle of lands a reasonable amount. They get better the more mounts and vehicles you have, so maybe in like red, white, and green, those are going to be like the most successful of these because they'll enter untapped the most, but they're going to enter untapped in a lot of different decks. I think they are a C+ collectively. So those are all the multicolored and colorless cards in Aetherdrift. In the next video, I'll take a look at all the white cards. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of the set review, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And once other set review videos are out, you'll be able to see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.